All that night they journeyed south. Most of the pack were mounted on their snargs, though the prisoners and their guards had to run along in the middle of the jostling bodies. Dawn came. The hares around had changed from a deep purple to a red again. The next days merged from the prisoners into one continuous blur of running feet and mole voices. The hares changed from crimson to orange and from orange to black. Feet blistered and bled, and minds were muddled by the constant pounding. Twice they crossed the doomy roads, late at night when no one was abroad, and passed by sleeping villages like shadows. And then there was a place above the carpet. The hares were bent almost double under the weight of the high gateland of the Vortgorns. First it was a glimmer between the hares. An hour later it loomed above them, the largest thing Pismir had ever seen. He had read about it back in the old days, but the descriptions in the books had not gotten it all right. You need bigger words than big. It looked like the largest thing there could ever have been. The carpet was big, but the carpet was everything. It didn't count. It was too big to have a size, but the high gateland was small enough to be really huge. It looked quite near, even from a long way off, and it shone. It was bronze. All the metal in the carpet came from there. Pismir knew that much. The Vortgorns had to trade with the whites for food, 'cause nothing grew in the high gateland. "Open in ye," said Pismir under his breath, while the party stopped for a brief rest under the very walls of the land. Bracando had immediately fallen asleep. He had shorter legs than everyone else. "What?" said Bracando, waking up. "That's the battle cry of the Vortgorns," Pismir said. Lots of people remembered it, but not for very long. It was often the last thing they heard. "An opinion" is written on the land. Huge metal letters. I've seen pictures. It takes you all day just to walk around one letter. "Who wrote them?" said Bracando, eyeing the guards. "The Vortgorns think that it was done by the Fray, and said Pismir. "Superstition, of course. There's probably some natural explanation. The Vortgorns used to say their letters under the land, too. They dug tunnels and found them. Some of them say," he concentrated, "Izabeth too." The Vortgorns seem to think that that's very important. "Giant letters can't just grow by themselves," said Bracando. "They might. Who knows?" They looked up at the land. Around the base of it ran a road. It was wider than a doomy road, yet in the shadow of the looming wall it looked thinner than a thread. "Anyone know much about the Vortgorns?" asked Pismir. "I've read about them, but I don't remember ever seeing one." "Like the doomy, but without their well-known flair and excitement," said Bracando. "Thank you," said Bane gravely. "Well, living on metal all the time must give you a very somber and mystical view of life," said Pismir. "Whose side are they on?" said Bracando. "Side? Their own, I suppose, just like everyone else." The moles milled around aimlessly, waiting for something. "I suppose we're waiting to get up there," said Bracando. "But how?" "Doomy patrols have been around the land and found no way in," said Bane. Pismir, who was squinting upward, said, "Ah, but I think this remarkable mechanism is the secret." High above them was a speck on the wall. Slowly it grew bigger, became a wide platform sliding down the bronze. They could see heads peering over the side of it. When it landed beside the pack, Pismir saw that it was a simple square made of hair planks with a railing around them. 4 bronze chains, one from each corner, rose up into the mists. A man stood at each corner. Each one was as tall as Bane. The men wore helmets, and body armor of beaten bronze, and carried by their sides long bronze swords. Their shields were bronze, round like the Highgate land itself, and their hair was the color of metal. They had short, square beards and square eyes that stared calmly ahead of them. Too much metal, Pismir thought. It enters the soul. Bracando whispered as they pushed forward into the platform. You haven't, seen or heard anyone, as it were, following us? Someone such as maybe your chief? The big fellow? Not a sign since we left Underlay, said Pismir. I've been watching and listening very carefully. Oh dear. Oh no, that's good news. It means that he's out there somewhere. If I had seen or heard anything, then I would have known it wasn't Glurk. He's a hunter, you see? Ah, good point. Ow! A whip stung Bracando's leg as the moles led their nervous mount onto the planks. When the last one was aboard, one of the bronze guards took a trumpet from his belt and blew a single note. The chain around them shook and rattled as the slack was taken up, and then, with a creaking, the platform swung off the ground and up towards the land. Pismir had been forced up against one of the railings by the press of animals, and so it was that he saw a shadow detach itself from the dust bush by the base of the wall and dash for the rising platform, trying to find a handhold on the underside. He saw it leap, but at that moment the platform swung, and he could not see the shadow again. Up rose the entrance to the land, through swirling fogs, and then he realized he was looking out over the carpet. Beneath him, the tips of the hairs gleamed in the mist. It made him dizzy, so he tried to take his mind off of things by giving the others a short lecture. The deaf meanies say that this land fell out of the above many years ago. The Vorkhorns were just another small tribe that lived nearby. They climbed it and hardly ever came down. Then why are there moles in the land? I'd rather not think about it, said Pismir. The Vorkhorns may be a bit dull, but I've never understood them to be evil. The platform ground up the wall until suddenly it stopped. Before them was a bronze gate, built on top of the wall. Just above it, heavy gantries carried the pulleys that raised and lowered the platform. They were plated with bronze and studded with spikes. The gateway was spiked, and the portcullis in it was tipped with more spikes. Beneath them, far beneath them, lay the carpet. They like their privacy, these people, remarked Bane. Behind him, Gormalish hissed, "Look your last at your precious carpet. You will not see it again." "Ah, melodrama," said Pismir. "So you think," Gormalish began. The last word ended on a yelp. Bracando had sunk his teeth into the mole's leg. Whimpering with pain and rage, Gormalish picked up the deaf meanie king and rushed with him to the edge of the platform, raising him over his head. Then he lowered his arms and smiled. "No," he said slowly. "No. Why? Soon you will wish that that I had thrown you overboard. Throwing you over now would be mercy, and I don't feel merciful." He dropped the trembling Bracando by the others just as the portcullis rose. "I wasn't shaking," said Bracando. "It's just a bit chilly up here." The moles marched into the Highgate land. Pismir saw a broad metal plateau with what looked like hills in the distance. On either side, as they marched, were cages with thick bars. They contained snargs. There were small brown snargs from the woodwall lands, red snargs from the west, and black snargs with overlong teeth. Whatever their color, they all had one thought in mind. They hurled themselves at the bars as the prisoners passed. On they went, and there were compounds where snargs were being broken in and trained. Farther there were more cages, bigger than those of the snargs. They contained strange creatures. They were huge. They had fat barrel bodies with ridiculously small wings and long, thin necks tipped with heads that wobbled slowly around as the prisoners passed. At the other end, they had stubby little tails. Their legs didn't look thick enough to support them. Oh, they were thick, but something that big ought to have legs as thick as giant hairs. One of the creatures poked its head through the bars and looked down at Pismir. Its eyes were large, but bright, and oddly intelligent, and topped by enormous, bushy brows. "A pone," Pismir said. "A pone! From the utter east, where fringes of the carpet touch the floor. The biggest thing in the carpet. Oh, if we had a few of these at our command." "I think perhaps they're under the command of the moles," said Bane. The pone watched him pass. They reached the angular metal hills and went through a dark archway. Inside they were handed over to other, dirtier moles. There was a maze of tunnels that echoed with the chip-chip of hammers, but these they passed, going deeper until they came to a dimly lit hall lined with doors. One door was open, and they were thrown inside. As they struggled on the dank floor, Gormalish's thin face grinned, lit red in the torchlight of the dungeons, and it appeared through the bars. "Enjoy the hospitality of our dungeons while you may. Soon you'll go into the mines. There you will not sleep, but you will be safe from fray." "Why do they talk like that?" said Pismir. "Melodrama. I'm amazed he doesn't go har, har, har." "Gormalish," said Bane. The mole reappeared. "Yes, lowly scum." "Lowly scum," said Pismir. "Imagination of a loaf of bread, that one." "When we get out of here, I'm going to find you and kill you," said Bane in quite a normal conversational tones. "I thought I ought to tell you now. I wouldn't want you to say afterward that you hadn't been warned." Gormalish stepped back and then said, "Your threats I treat with scorn. Har, har, har." Pismir nodded happily. He knew he would sooner or later say that to himself. They lay in the darkness, listening to the distant knocking of hammers. "So these are the mines," said Bracando, "where my people have been taken, mining metal." "Everyone's people, by the sound of it," said Pismir. He lay staring at the dark, wondering about Glurk. He could have imagined the shadow, and Snibble, well, perhaps he did get out before the roof fell in. They were roughly woken by the prodding of a spear. Two moles were standing in the doorway, grinning down at them. "These three for the mines, eh?" "Aye," came a growl from outside. Pismir's ears pricked. That one's a bit small, and that one's an old cotter. Still, use up the old ones first, eh?" "Let's see 'em," came the voice from outside. The prisoners were dragged upright and had their thongs inspected before they were thrust out into the dim hall. A bronze-clad Wartgorn stood there, terrible in the half-light. "You stupid oafs," he snarled at the moles. "Look at their bonds, practically falling off." And he strode forward and caught up Pismir's hand. The old man looked for a moment into familiar brown eyes, one at which winked at him. "We tighten them special," said one mole. "Oh, yes. Look at this one, then." The two moles slunk over and stood on either side of the Vortgorn. He said, "They're as tight as a—" The Vortgorn reached out and placed one gnarled hand about each hairy neck. The voice faded into a strangled squeak. The Vortgorn brought his hands together with a satisfying crack and let the stunned creatures drop. Glurk removed his helmet. "Well, here we are then," he said. He couldn't resist dancing a little jig in front of their staring faces. Then he put his helmet back on. "We left you in Underlay. How'd you come here? Was it you I saw?" asked Pismir. "It was, wasn't it?" "Safety first, stories later," said Glurk. He took a knife from his belt and cut their thongs. They rubbed some relief into their numb wrists while they dragged the guards into the cell and locked them in, despite Bracondo's pointing out that the best time to kill an enemy was when they were unconscious. Glurk came back with swords for them. "They're nasty things, but better than nothing if it comes to a fight," he said. "Try to look like prisoners if anyone sees you. There's all sorts up here. You might not be noticed." Glurk led. In his Vortgorn armor, twice they met mole guards who paid no attention to him until it was too late. "Where are we going?" said Pismir. "I found some friends." "We ought to rescue the prisoners," said Bracondo. "There's thousands of them. Thousands of moles, too," said Glurk. "Too many." "That's right," said Bane. "We got to get out. Then we can get help. And don't say that if we got a lot of Deaf Meanie prisoners, it means that we've got an army right inside their lines." "I've seen some of the prisoners too," said Glurk. "They ain't got any condition to fight. And if you want my opinion—" "You're talking about Deaf Meanies, you know," said Bracondo stoutly. Glurk peered around a corner and then beckoned them to follow him. "I know," he said, "and it's still true. What I'm saying is, it's not a case of stealing a bunch of keys and unlocking a few doors and shouting, 'Har, har, har, my people, throw off your shackles.' This is real, and I've been listening. You know why the moles attacked Jeopard?" To enslave the proud people," said Bracondo. "For grit." "Grit? That's what Jeopard's built on, isn't it? Stone chisels. See? They use dozens of them to hack out a bit of metal." "My lovely city?" "Grit," said Glurk. "My palace?" "Grit, too." "Metal?" said Bane. "They're trying to get as much metal as they can. Metal weapons'll beat varnish and wood any day." "Why, all this effort, I wonder," said Pismir. "War's only a few days away," said Bane. "That's why. We've got to warn the people." "Come on, in here," said Glurk. Here was a long cave mined out of bronze. Light filtered in from the holes in the ceiling, showing dim shadows lining the walls. The air was warm and smelled of animal. They heard the shifting of great feet in the stalls and deep breathing. There was a moment, and a pair of green eyes came forward towards them in the semi-darkness. "What's your business here?" said the mole guard. "Ah," said Glurk, "I have brought the prisoners. Har, har, har." The guard looked suspicious at the four of them. "For what?" it said. Glurk blinked at him. Enough of this talking, har, 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 he said eventually, and hit the guard on the head. The green eyes went out. I runs out of ideas after a while, said Glurk. Pismir's eyes had grown accustomed to the gloom. It was a big cave, but it didn't look as big as it really ought to have because of the enormous size of the things in it. These are pones, aren't they? Said Bakondo. Not easy to mistake for anything else. Why are they here? Asked Pismir. They turns the wheels for the lifting platform, said Glurk. They're used for all the heavy work, know something? They're intelligent. No, that's just a story, said Pismir airily. They look bright, I'll grant you that, but the head's tiny compared to the body. They've got a brain the size of a dried pea. But a very clever dried pea, said Glurk. I lay low in here last night. They've got a language, all made up of thumps and nose honks. Watch. A tiny head was lowered toward him out of the shadows, and two bright eyes blinked. If you can understand me, stamp twice, he said hoarsely. Thud, thud. Even Glurk himself looked surprised. These are friends. You'll help, okay? Thud, thud. That means yes, said Glurk. Really? Said Pismir. Here's a saddle, by the stall. It was more like a small castle. It had wide girths made of red cloth, studded with bronze, and a roof over it, hung with curtains and bells. Inside were cushioned seats, and on the decorated harness was the word Acretung in tarnished bronze letters. Pismir sidled closer to the pone while the others were manhandling the saddle. He held up his hand with the fingers spread out. How many fingers am I holding up? He said suspiciously. Thud, 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 thud. Aha! So much for thud. Lucky guess. The pone lumbered down onto his knees to let them heave the saddle onto his back. Then he opened his mouth and trumpeted. It sounded like the creaking of a door magnified 1,000 times, but it wavered and changed as well, and seemed to contain a lot of busy little other sounds. Language, thought Pismir. Language is without words, but still language. I wonder if the whites invented that too. People used to have language without words. We still have some. We say, and arg. Don't we? What am I thinking? These are animals. Just very bright ones, perhaps. Very bright indeed. The other pones raised their heads and answered with a variety of blasts and trills. Glurk motioned the others up to Acretung's back. The moles will have heard that, said Pismir. Won't matter, said Glurk. The pones have decided to go home. You mean they could have gone at any time, said Bakondo, watching the huge animals leave their stalls in an orderly line. They liked it here when the Vortgorns ran the place, said Glurk. They like stuff they find interesting. The moles don't interest them anymore. They don't like them. I think they think we're interesting. Now listen, Glurk, said Pismir. I mean, I'm not saying you're not, quite bright, but I don't think you could have learned a language and all these other things in just a few... I didn't, said Glurk, smirking. Knew what to expect before I come here. How? Enough of this talking, har, 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 said Glurk. Tell you later. Be polite, by the way. She said they understand people very well. I don't believe it, said Pismir. One of the pones blew a raspberry in his ear. That means they think you're interesting, said Glurk. And who's she? Pismir demanded. Tell you soon, said Glurk. He was enjoying himself in quite a way. For the whole of his life, Pismir had known more than he did. It was nice, just for once, to be Mr. Answers. At the far end of the cave was a thick bronze door. The first two ponies walked straight into it, tearing it off its hinges. Once outside, the herd broke into a trot, with Ektung moving up in the lead. On his trumpeted signal, it became a gallop. It looked ponderous and funny until you realized that those great big bouncing balls would walk through a house without noticing it. Upon Ekutung's back, the four of them were shaken like small peas in a big pot. Pismir saw a pack of mounted moles galloping after them, spears ready to throw. Ekutung's must have seen them too, because he bellowed like a distressed trumpet. 3 ponies detached themselves from the herd and turned. The moles suddenly realized that they weren't chasing a herd of fleeing animals. Pismir stood up on the saddle. "They've gone over them," he said. "What do you mean? They jumped?" Bracando asked. "No, I mean just over." "They hate moles," said Glurk. "Hate them more than any other creature do. They think they're very uninteresting." Ahead of them was the archway, surrounded by a milling throng of moles and Vortgorns. "But all they've got to do is lower that platform, and we're done for," shouted Pismir. "They won't," yelled Glurk, and he pointed. "He powers the platform." Besides the gateway, they noticed for the first time there was a large treadmill. There was a pone on it, and a pack of moles were attacking the pone with whips and goads. But it stood, trumpeting. Akutung bellowed back. "They'll rescue it," said Glurk. "By the way, what was it? Oh yeah, they hate sharp things even more than moles. So we got to be careful with spears and things." Some ponies hurled themselves towards the treadmill, tossing moles aside like dust. Their heavy jaws snapped through the bars. The caged pone shrugged itself free, paused for a moment to stamp on a couple of moles that had been poking it the hardest, and then leapt through the gateway. "They must be mad," said Pismir. "That platform won't hold them." "We shall see," said Glurk as they clattered onto it. The other ponies piled on behind them, and Pismir noticed that, though they went out of their way to trample on moles, they avoided running Vortgorns down. Vortgorns were still a bit interesting. He expected the platform to split under the weight of the ponies. It didn't quite, but something clanged above them, and the remains of the treadmill spun until it was nothing but a blur. The chain shrieked over the pulleys, and the wall rushed past. Only Glurk sat calmly. Even Pismir had crouched down in the saddle. They were going to be crushed when they hit the bottom. He knew. Bracando hung on and moaned with his eyes shut. Even Bane had slumped down, bracing himself for the shock. So only Glurk saw the ponies leap from the platform one by one. The tiny wings opened. They were too small to carry the ponies, but they worked. They whirled madly, and the ponies stayed up, drifting gently between the hairs. Only with Ekutung's weight upon it, the platform slowed down and hit the dust with a thud. Ekutung lumbered off while all them ponies crashed down through the hairs like falling fruit. The others looked up at Glurk's face. "You knew we wouldn't crash," said Pismir accusingly. "Hoped," said Glurk. "I wasn't too sure, even after all Cluana said." "Who's Cluana? Is he the she?" said Pismir. He was badly rattled. He was kind of in his way, but knowing more than Glurk about almost everything was one of the few things that he was sure he was good at. He wasn't used to this. Another poem bounced into the desk beside them. They're lighter than they look, he thought. Balloons with wings. No wonder they don't like sharp objects. Kulana's hard to describe, said Glurk. I think she's sort of a white. Sort of a white, said Pismir. Well, you'll have to ask her yourself, said Glurk. We're going to see her now. Akiton's head dipped, and he began to plod between the hairs. No, we're not, said Bane. We must go to where? Back to Jeopard, you mean? Where's only a few days away. I have to tell them about this. They might know already, said Pismir glumly. They don't, said Glurk. How do you know? We're the ones who know about the mole army, said Glurk. We'll have to go to Where and warn the people. But first we got to go back and talk to Kulana. This white? Why? Said Pismir. To tell her what we've seen, said Glurk, smiling in a puzzled kind of way. He scratched his head. So she can remember what we tell her now and tell me 2 days ago when I met her. Wakanda opened his mouth, but Pismir waved him into silence. Whites remember the future as well as the past, he said. But look, they never tell anyone, Glurk. This one does, said Glurk. Don't look at me like that. You think I could make this kind of stuff up?